You know, there are moments in history that change everything. A single discovery, one breakthrough, and the world shifts on its axis. September 20th, 1940. A hot, sticky afternoon in Washington. A young woman bent over worksheets, searching for patterns in what looked like gibberish to anyone else. Her name was Genevieve Grotjan. She was 27 years old, and she was about to crack one of the most sophisticated codes of World War II. Now, I want you to imagine something for a moment. Imagine being handed jumbled letters, meaningless sequences that seem to have no rhyme or reason. You're told that somewhere in this chaos, there's a pattern, a structure, a key that could unlock thousands of messages between enemy governments. Messages that contain secrets about military plans, diplomatic negotiations, strategies that could determine the fate of nations. And you've got to find it. No pressure, right? That was Genevieve's job. And on that Friday afternoon in September, she found what her team had been hunting for 18 brutal months. But here's the thing. Her story didn't start in a secret government building. It started in Buffalo, New York. And it's one of those stories that reminds you that heroes don't always wear uniforms or get their names in headlines. Sometimes they're just brilliant, determined people who see patterns where others see noise. Genevieve Marie Grotjan was born on April 30th, 1913, in Buffalo. She was an only child. Her father, Frederick, was a pharmacist whose parents had immigrated from Germany. Her mother stayed home, raising their daughter in a modest household where education mattered. You could see the spark in Genevieve early on. Math wasn't just a subject to her, it was a language, one she spoke fluently. At Bennett High School, she didn't just excel in mathematics, she tackled Latin and science with the same intensity. By the time she graduated in 1930, she'd earned the distinction of salutatorian, second in her class. She went on to the university at Buffalo with clear ambitions. She wanted to be a math teacher. Simple as that. It was a respectable profession for a woman in the 1930s, one of the few STEM fields where women could actually find work. And Genevieve threw herself into it. She studied hard, graduated summa cum laude in February 1936 with a degree in mathematics. The honors kept piling up. Everything pointed to a straightforward teaching career ahead. Except she couldn't get hired. You see, this was the Great Depression. Teaching jobs were scarce, and even when they existed, preference often went to men. It's one of those frustrating historical truths. Here was this incredibly talented mathematician, ready to inspire the next generation, and nobody would give her a chance. So, she did what she had to do. She worked as a substitute teacher, tutored students in math and science. From 1936 to 37, she pieced together whatever work she could find. Then she landed a position as a graduate assistant in the University of Buffalo's mathematics department, teaching trigonometry and analytic geometry while working toward a master's degree. But by 1938, Genevieve knew she needed something more stable. She moved to Washington, D.C. Big change for a Buffalo girl. She took a job with the Railroad Retirement Board as a statistical clerk. Not glamorous. She spent her days calculating pensions for railway workers. But here's where fate steps in. As part of her job, she had to take a civil service mathematics test. Just routine, right? A requirement for a potential pay raise. She sat down, worked through the problems, and turned it in. Probably didn't think much of it. But someone noticed her score. William Friedman noticed. And if you're going to have someone notice your test score, William Friedman was the guy you wanted. Friedman was the head of the United States Army's Signals Intelligence Service, the SIS. The man was a legend in the making. He'd essentially founded modern American cryptology, invented terms like cryptanalysis, written the textbooks, built the organization from scratch. And he had an eye for talent. In 1939, Friedman made Genevieve an offer. He couldn't tell her exactly what the job was. That was classified. It was described obliquely as work in the code section. But the pay was decent, and Genevieve said yes. She became a junior cryptanalyst, a civilian employee working on some of the most sensitive intelligence operations in the country. And she had no idea that within a year, she'd make one of the most significant breakthroughs in the history of American code breaking. Now, let's talk about what she was up against. Purple. That's what the Americans called it. The Japanese called it the Type B cipher machine, or the 97 system. Japan introduced Purple in February 1939 to replace their older Red code, which the Americans had already cracked. Purple was sophisticated, way more complex than Red. It used stepping switches, the kind you'd find in telephone systems, instead of traditional rotors. The machine had 2 typewriters connected by a plug board and a box containing encryption mechanisms. When you typed a message in plain text on one typewriter, Purple would encrypt it and output the ciphertext on the second typewriter. The encryption system divided the 26-letter alphabet into 2 groups. The 6s were 6 letters that encrypted separately. The 20s were the remaining 20 consonants, which went through 3 successive substitution tables. Each group had its own encryption method. The 6s were relatively straightforward, and the SIS team cracked those early on. But the 20s, that's what stumped them. For month after month, they couldn't figure out the pattern. The cipher seemed impenetrable. And the stakes, they couldn't have been higher. Japan used Purple for their most sensitive diplomatic communications, messages between Tokyo and Japanese embassies around the world, instructions to ambassadors, reports on negotiations with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, intelligence about military strategy, though it was primarily a diplomatic code. The Japanese Foreign Office considered Purple unbreakable. They were confident. Too confident. Meanwhile, at SIS headquarters in the munitions building in Washington, a small team worked around the clock trying to crack Purple. William Friedman led the effort, but the day-to-day work fell to a handful of brilliant cryptanalysts. Frank Rollitt headed the Purple team. There was also Abraham Sinkoff, Solomon Kuhlbach, and Genevieve Grotjan. They had help from the Navy's cryptologic unit, too. Men like Leo Rosen, who figured out that Purple used telephone stepping switches instead of rotors. That was huge, because it meant they were dealing with a completely different type of machine than they'd expected. But even with that knowledge, they were stuck. They could intercept messages. They could see the encrypted text. They knew the structure. 6 letters here, 20 letters there. But they couldn't figure out how the 20s group was being encrypted. What was the pattern? How did the stepping switches move? Where was the vulnerability? Months turned into a year. The pressure mounted. War was coming. Everyone could feel it. And American military intelligence was flying blind because they couldn't read Japan's diplomatic traffic. The work was grueling, tedious beyond belief. Imagine staring at columns of letters for hours, days, weeks, looking for any tiny hint of repetition, any cycle, any weakness in the encryption. Most cryptanalysts worked on specific theories or attacked particular aspects of the problem. Genevieve had her own approach. She was methodical, patient. She'd arrange messages side by side, comparing them, looking for relationships between the cipher text and what they suspected might be the plain text underneath. September 20th, 1945. Friday. It was hot and humid, the kind of sticky Washington afternoon where you can't get comfortable. Genevieve sat at her plain wooden table, surrounded by worksheets. She'd been working with 6 messages that had been partially reconstructed using Rosen's device. She was examining the larger letter group, the 20s. And then she saw it. Repeated sequences in the cipher texts, patterns that appeared at regular intervals, cycles. She'd found the evidence they'd been searching for. The stepping switches in Purple's 20s mechanism moved in a predictable pattern. It was cyclical, regular, and that meant it was vulnerable. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Genevieve carried her worksheets over to the group of men deep in conversation. Frank Rollitt was there, So were Al Small and Bob Ferner. She tried to get Rowlett's attention politely, and when he saw what she'd discovered, pandemonium. Al Small saw it immediately. He jumped up yelling, "Whoopee!" and ran around the room, holding his hands above his head like a prizefighter. Bob Ferner, normally quiet and reserved, clapped his hands like an excited child, shouting, "Hooray! Hooray!" Rowlett jumped up and down, yelling, "That's it! That's it!" Genevieve's eyes filled with tears. The emotion of the moment just overwhelmed her. People from other sections rushed over to see what the commotion was about. William Friedman pushed through the crowd. Rowlett pointed to Genevieve's worksheets and said, "Look what Jen has just discovered." Friedman examined them and understood instantly. He looked suddenly exhausted, the weight of 18 months of pressure finally lifting. To mark the moment, someone sent out for Cokes. 1 week later, on September 27th, Rowlett handed Friedman 2 completely decrypted purple messages. It was the tripartite agreement between Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. The timing was almost poetic. The breakthrough came on the very day this alliance was announced to the world, and now the United States could read their most secret communications. By October 1940, the team had recovered 1/3 of the indicator settings. By early 1941, they'd built functioning purple analog machines, constructed with about $685 worth of parts, mainly telephone equipment. These machines could decrypt purple messages mechanically. The intelligence that came from purple decrypts was codenamed Magic, and it was invaluable, absolutely vital. The United States could read Japanese diplomatic traffic almost in real time. Sometimes American officials could read the messages before the Japanese embassy in Washington had even decrypted them. Magic gave American leaders a window into Japanese thinking, into the negotiations happening between Tokyo and Berlin, into the discussions about war and peace. One source proved particularly golden. Baron Hiroshi Oshima, Japan's ambassador to Nazi Germany. Oshima was an ardent nationalist with personal access to Hitler and the top Nazi leadership. He toured the Atlantic Wall, visited the Eastern Front, met regularly with Hitler, Ribbentrop, and other Nazi officials, and being a meticulous military officer, he wrote incredibly detailed reports back to Tokyo, all encrypted with purple. Oshima's messages gave the Allies critical intelligence about German military planning, troop deployments, defensive fortifications, strategic intentions. In November 1943, after a 4-day tour of the Atlantic Wall, Oshima sent a message describing every German division's location along the French coast, their manpower, their weaponry. He detailed tank ditches built in triangular cross-sections, 5 meters across the top, 3.5 meters deep. He described turrets built in continuous lines close to the shore, each equipped with machine guns and grenade launchers. This intelligence proved crucial for planning the Normandy invasion. General George Marshall later called Oshima our main basis of information regarding Hitler's intentions in Europe. The Japanese ambassador died in 1975, never knowing that the Allies had been reading his reports throughout the entire war. Now, here's something important to understand. Magic didn't prevent Pearl Harbor. People often wonder about that. Why didn't we know? Well, purple was a diplomatic code, not a military one. The Japanese Navy used different codes for their operational planning. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a military operation, and those details weren't sent through diplomatic channels. Magic provided strategic intelligence, but it couldn't tell you where the carriers were or when the bombs would fall. That said, Magic was instrumental in other battles. The Battle of Midway in June 1942, American cryptanalysts used a combination of magic and naval code intercepts to figure out Japanese plans. They confirmed that AF meant Midway Island by having the Midway garrison send a fake message about water supply problems, then intercepting a Japanese message saying AF is out of water. That intelligence helped produce one of the most decisive American victories in the Pacific. Genevieve's breakthrough was recognized immediately within the SIS. In 1941, she was promoted and given a $300 annual raise. Not a fortune, but significant. More importantly, she was assigned to exceptionally difficult cryptographic and cryptanalytic responsibilities. She'd proven herself. She wasn't just a junior analyst anymore. She was a trusted member of one of the most important intelligence operations in American history. In 1946, after the war ended, she received the Exceptional Civilian Service Award from Brigadier General Paul Everton Peabody. It was one of the highest honors a civilian could receive for wartime service. But Genevieve's contributions didn't end with purple. In 1943, she was reassigned to a new problem, the Soviet problem. Even though the Soviet Union was an American ally during World War II, there were already tensions, suspicions. The U.S. Army began intercepting Soviet intelligence communications, messages sent by the KGB and the GRU, Soviet military intelligence. These messages used one-time pad encryption, which when used correctly is mathematically unbreakable. Each pad is a list of random numbers used only once to encrypt a message. If you never reuse a pad, the system is completely secure. But the Soviets made a mistake. Under the pressure of war, particularly during the German siege of Moscow in 1941, the Soviet codebook manufacturer produced duplicate one-time pads. About 35,000 pages of duplicates. They tried to minimize the damage by sending the duplicates to widely separated users, but the duplication was there. And that created a vulnerability. The project to exploit this vulnerability was eventually called Venona. It would run for decades, remaining one of America's most closely guarded secrets until 1995. And Genevieve Grotjan Feinstein played a crucial role in the early stages. In November 1944, Genevieve made another significant breakthrough. She was working with a team including Lieutenant Richard Halleck and others on Soviet trade traffic. She recognized that there were instances where the Soviets were reusing one-time pad pages. This was the critical insight that allowed American cryptographers to begin breaking into Soviet communications. It enabled the identification of when duplicate pads were being used, which opened the door to cryptanalysis. This discovery, combined with later work by linguists like Meredith Gardner, eventually revealed the extent of Soviet espionage in the United States. The Venona decrypts exposed Soviet agents in the Manhattan Project, the State Department, the Treasury, even the White House. They confirmed many of the accusations that had seemed like paranoia during the McCarthy era were actually based on reality, though the methods used by McCarthy were still destructive and harmful. Genevieve continued working at the Signal Intelligence Service and its successor organizations through the war and into the early Cold War. She was part of the Arlington Hall Station operation, which by the end of World War II employed about 10,000 people. Around 7,000 of them were women. Think about that. Women made up 70% of American domestic code-breaking force. They worked in shifts, 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. They lived in barracks. They operated machines. They analyzed patterns. They translated messages. And they kept it all secret. The vast majority of these women never spoke about their work, not even to their families, for decades. In 1943, Genevieve married Hyman Feinstein, a chemist who worked on the Manhattan Project at the National Bureau of Standards. They had a son in 1946. They named him Ellis. By all accounts, they built a good life together. But in 1947, Genevieve resigned from her government position. The reasons aren't entirely clear from the historical record. Maybe she wanted to focus on raising Ellis. Maybe she was exhausted after years of intense classified work. Maybe she just needed a change. Whatever the reason, she stepped away from cryptanalysis. She didn't step away from mathematics, though. From around 1957 to 1961, Genevieve taught mathematics at George Mason University, where her husband was a chemistry professor. She was passing on the knowledge she'd accumulated over decades, teaching the next generation of mathematicians. It was, in a way, coming back to that original dream she'd had back in Buffalo, to be a math teacher. To share her love of the subject with students. She finally got to do that, even if it came later than she'd planned. But life dealt the Feinsteins a devastating blow. In 1969, their son Ellis died suddenly at age 22. He'd just graduated from Swarthmore College with a degree in mathematics. He was an honors student, following in his mother's footsteps. He'd won a National Science Foundation fellowship for graduate study. He was supposed to attend MIT. Instead, he died in the family's living room from a previously undiagnosed heart condition. It's hard to even imagine the pain. Your only child, brilliant and full of promise, taken so suddenly. Hyman and Genevieve somehow carried on. They stayed in their home in Fairfax, Virginia. They maintained their routines. They endured. Hyman Feinstein died in 1995. Before his death, he established a Genevieve Feinstein Award in cryptography within the Department of Mathematical Sciences at George Mason University. It's given annually to an outstanding undergraduate mathematics major. It was his way of honoring his wife's contributions, of making sure her name would be remembered. Genevieve lived another 11 years as a widow. She died on August 10, 2006, at age 93. By most accounts, she lived a quiet life in her later years. She wasn't one for fanfare or publicity. In fact, for decades, almost nobody outside the intelligence community knew what Genevieve Grotjan Feinstein had accomplished. The work was classified. The people who knew her role, they knew. William Friedman knew. Frank Rollet knew. Her colleagues at SIS and Arlington Hall knew. But the general public? They had no idea. And Genevieve herself was modest about her contributions. In a 1991 interview with historian David Kahn, she downplayed her breakthrough. "Maybe I was just lucky," she said. "I was excited and interested and looking forward to working on the mechanism. I regarded it more as just one step in a series of steps." Just lucky. Can you imagine? This woman had cracked one of the most sophisticated codes of World War II. Her work had enabled thousands of decryptions that informed Allied strategy. She'd later contributed to breaking Soviet codes during the Cold War, and she called it luck. That's the kind of humility you don't see often, but it also reflects something deeper. Genevieve understood that cryptanalysis was a team effort. She saw herself as one piece of a larger puzzle. Her breakthrough mattered, yes, but it only mattered because there were people like Rollet and Friedman and Rosen who could take that discovery and run with it, who could build the machines, who could analyze the decrypts, who could get the intelligence to the people who needed it. The recognition came later, but it did come. In 2010, 4 years after her death, the National Security Agency inducted Genevieve Grotjan Feinstein into the Cryptologic Hall of Honor. It's one of the highest honors in American intelligence. She was recognized alongside other pioneers whose work built the foundation of modern signals intelligence. The induction process is selective. They review about 65 nominations each year and only induct a handful. The NSA also designated her as a Women in American Cryptology honoree, acknowledging her among the early female pioneers in the field. In 2018, the University at Buffalo featured her in their alumni magazine with the headline, "An American Hero." It was overdue recognition from her alma mater. The article detailed her breakthrough, her modesty, her impact. It helped bring her story to a wider audience. Buffalo could finally claim one of its own, a woman who'd grown up in their city and gone on to change the course of history. There's even a children's magazine article about her now. Highlights magazine ran a piece in 2017 explaining her purple achievement to young readers. Imagine that. Kids reading about Genevieve Grotjan, learning about cryptanalysis, maybe getting inspired to study mathematics themselves. But here's what gets me about Genevieve's story. She represents something we don't talk about enough: the hidden figures of World War II. No, I'm not just talking about the movie. I'm talking about the thousands, tens of thousands, of people who did essential war work that nobody ever heard about. The women at Arlington Hall Station and the Naval Communications Annex. The African American code breakers who worked in segregated units, keeping tabs on commercial codes to make sure American companies weren't trading with the enemy. The mathematicians and linguists and pattern analysts who showed up every day and did mind-numbingly difficult work for years, all in complete secrecy. Arlington Hall Station, where Genevieve worked, employed about 10,000 people by the end of the war. Most of them were women. Many were young, recruited straight out of college or even before graduation. They came from all over the country. Small towns, big cities, farming communities. They were told they'd be doing important work for the war effort, but they couldn't be told what exactly. They signed secrecy oaths. They were warned that talking about their work, even to family members, would be considered treason. So they didn't talk. They showed up every day. They worked their shifts. They went home. And they kept the secret. Some of these women intercepted coded messages. Some operated the cryptanalytic machines that helped break codes. Some were translators, turning decrypted Japanese or German into English. Some, like Genevieve, were cryptanalysts who searched for patterns and vulnerabilities. Each role was essential. Each person mattered. And yet, for decades, almost nobody knew their names. Liza Mundy's book Code Girls helped change that. Published in 2017, it brought many of these stories to light. But even then, the research was challenging because so many records had been destroyed or remained classified. The African American codebreakers at Arlington Hall faced additional challenges. They worked in segregated units, separated from their white counterparts. About 15% of Arlington Hall's workforce was black, which was actually unusual for the time. Some historians believe Eleanor Roosevelt may have pushed for this level of integration. But integration didn't mean equality. The black codebreakers worked in separate sections, often on commercial codes, rather than the high-priority military and diplomatic codes. They identified companies doing business with Nazi Germany or Japan, tracking economic intelligence. Their contributions were vital, but they received even less recognition than their white colleagues. Historian Liza Mundy could only identify two names from the available records: Annie Briggs, who headed up the production unit, and Ethel Just, who led a team of translators. Their supervisor, William Coffey, won an award for his wartime leadership. But the women who did the actual work remained anonymous. This is the reality of intelligence work during World War II. It was segregated. It was sexist. Women were paid less than men for doing the same work. African Americans faced discrimination and limited opportunities. And yet, despite all these barriers, they showed up, they did the work, they helped win the war. Genevieve Grotjan Feinstein's story sits within this larger context. She was one of the lucky ones. She had opportunities many women didn't. She was white, which gave her access that black women were denied. She was incredibly talented, yes. But she also benefited from having William Friedman notice her test score, from being in the right place at the right time, from working on a problem where her particular skills, pattern recognition, mathematical analysis, tireless patience, could make the difference. And make a difference she did. The Purple Breakthrough in September 1940 changed American intelligence capabilities. It gave U.S. leaders access to Japanese diplomatic thinking at the highest levels. It provided warnings, not always heeded, about Japan's intentions. It supplied crucial intelligence about German military planning through Oshima's detailed reports. It helped shorten the war. Historians estimate that Allied cryptanalysis, including the breaking of Purple, may have shortened World War II by as much as 2 years. 2 years. Think about the lives saved, the cities spared from bombing, the suffering prevented. That's the real impact of Genevieve's work. Not just the technical achievement, though that was remarkable, but the human cost that was avoided because intelligence gave leaders better information to make decisions. The same goes for her work on Venona. Breaking into Soviet communications during the Cold War allowed the United States to identify espionage networks, to understand Soviet capabilities and intentions, to make more informed policy decisions during one of the most dangerous periods in human history. The intelligence from Venona informed everything from counterintelligence operations to nuclear weapons policy. It exposed spies like Klaus Fuchs and helped confirm the guilt of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Again, Genevieve's work had consequences that rippled out far beyond the walls of Arlington Hall Station. What strikes me most about Genevieve is her consistency. She was brilliant, yes, but she was also humble, hard-working, focused. She didn't seek glory. She did the job in front of her to the best of her abilities. When she couldn't find a teaching job, she tutored. When she took a boring statistical clerk position, she excelled at the math tests anyway. When she was assigned to crack purple, she showed up every day and looked for patterns. When she made her breakthrough, she brought it to her colleagues without fanfare. When she was reassigned to the Soviet problem, she applied herself with the same determination. And when she finally got to teach mathematics later in life, she did that too. She dealt with tragedy, the loss of her only son, with quiet dignity. She supported her husband's career. She made a substantial bequest to George Mason University when she died, $1 million, continuing to support education and mathematics even after her death. She lived 93 years, most of them in relative obscurity. She never wrote a memoir, never sought interviews or publicity. She kept the secrets she'd been asked to keep. She was, in the best sense of the word, a professional. So why tell her story now? Why does it matter that we remember Genevieve Grotjan Fennerstein? Well, for one thing, accuracy matters. For too long, the history of World War II cryptanalysis focused almost exclusively on men. William Friedman gets credit, and rightfully so. Frank Rowlett too. But the women who did so much of the actual work, they were footnotes if they were mentioned at all. That's changing now, slowly, as documents get declassified and historians dig deeper. But we still have work to do in acknowledging the full scope of women's contributions to the war effort and to intelligence work specifically. Second, Genevieve's story reminds us that genius comes in many forms. She wasn't flashy. She didn't have a dramatic persona. She was quiet, methodical, persistent. She saw patterns. She had the patience to stare at jumbled letters for months until the answer revealed itself. That kind of intelligence is easy to overlook because it doesn't announce itself, but it's essential. Wars aren't just won by generals and soldiers. They're won by people who can solve impossible problems, who can crack unbreakable codes, who can turn chaos into clarity. Third, her story matters because it shows what's possible when you remove barriers to opportunity. Genevieve almost didn't have this career. She wanted to be a math teacher and couldn't get hired. She took a clerical job because she needed work. If William Friedman hadn't noticed her test score, if he hadn't given her a chance, if she'd been dismissed because she was a woman, the entire trajectory of purple codebreaking might have been different. Maybe someone else would have found the pattern eventually. Or maybe not. We'll never know. But we do know that when talented people are given opportunities, regardless of their gender or background, amazing things can happen. Finally, Genevieve's story is just inherently inspiring. Here we're a girl from Buffalo who loved math, who faced disappointment and kept going, who said yes to an opportunity she didn't fully understand, who worked for 18 months on a problem that seemed impossible, and who, on one hot Friday afternoon, saw what nobody else had seen. That moment, when she walked over to Frank Rowlett with her worksheets, when Al Small started jumping around yelling, when tears filled her eyes, that was a turning point, not just for American intelligence, not just for the war, but for her own life. She'd proven something to herself and to the world. She mattered. Her work mattered. She could solve the unsolvable. The legacy of Genevieve Grotjan Feinstein lives on in multiple ways. There's the award at George Mason University in her name, encouraging new generations of mathematicians. There's her induction into the NSA Cryptological Hall of Honor, ensuring that people in the intelligence community know her story. There's the growing body of historical work that places her in proper context among the giants of World War II cryptanalysis. And there's something less tangible but equally important, the example she set. The proof that one person, working diligently on a difficult problem, can change the course of history. In the end, Genevieve Grotjan Feinstein was exactly what America needed when it needed it most: a brilliant mind, a diligent worker, a pattern seeker, someone who could look at chaos and find order, someone who could stare at impossible puzzles until they revealed their secrets. She helped break the codes that let America read enemy communications. She helped shorten a terrible war. She helped save countless lives. And then, when the war was over, she went back to being a private citizen. She taught math. She raised her son. She lived her life quietly. She kept her secrets. But the secrets are out now, and we can finally say what should have been said 70 years ago. Thank you, Genevieve, for your service, for your brilliance, for your perseverance. For that moment on September 20th, 1940, when you saw the pattern nobody else could see, for the lives saved because of your work, for the example you set. You were truly an American hero, and your story deserves to be remembered.